Escaping the metrics fallacy. I was in an assembly of Scrum Masters recently, and a familiar topic dominated the discussion: metrics. Scrum Masters are a broad church. Former project managers, PMO leaders, management consultants, and each bring different perspectives and priorities. Some focus on people, others on processes, still others on tools. But on this day, much of our time was spent discussing how to input and extract better, more consistent data from our tooling, most of which is hand-keyed and hand-cranked. It crystallized a deep concern I've had for a while. My own path into this world was unconventional. I was a natural-born geek who got distracted by my lived experience of growing up in working class in Liverpool in the 1980s, which pulled me towards public policy and the hope of making a positive difference at scale. I discovered I couldn't, not in the ways that mattered. So I came back to where I'd always belonged: technology, working in private organizations, delivering socially valuable products and services alongside the brilliant people I kept meeting in this world. And yet, there we were, a room full of intelligent, well-intentioned people spending much of our day on the mechanics of manually maintained metrics. In our drive for data-driven decisions, we've become obsessed with gathering consistent, coherent sets of numbers from our tools. But what if these metrics are a fallacy? Before we go further, I need to arm you with a conceptual tool that will unlock everything that follows. It's one of the most significant ontological concepts I've encountered in my 47 years. And once you see it, you'll start recognizing it everywhere, especially in the corporate theater of metrics and reporting. Buckle up. This is going to get heavy quickly. But I promise it gets easier, and it's worth a slog. The linguist Ferdinand de Saussure gave us a useful lens for this: the sign. He argued that a sign consists of two parts: the signifier, the symbol, like the word tree, and the signified, the concept of the tree itself. The problem occurs when these two parts become disconnected. When this happens, in our world of work, we end up with words like agile, cycle time, or story points, or OKRs, that everyone uses confidently, which have become untethered from any meaningful reality. Keep this framework in mind. We'll return to it repeatedly as we dissect exactly how our industry has mastered this disconnection. In our work, the metric, for example, cycle time or story point, is a signifier that is supposed to point to a signified concept, for example, actual value delivered. But I believe they've become disconnected. Firstly, we are mistaking outputs, the stuff we build, for outcomes, the value we create. And secondly, this often goes further and deeper. The metrics and tooling become detached even from the outputs. They create their own parallel reality, a self-serving metric bureaucracy, an entire system dedicated to producing and discussing numbers that are fundamentally detached from any actual value, or even the work itself. Let me show you how broken this gets in practice. Comparing apples and something else. In large corporates, it's fiendishly difficult to quantitatively trace the value chain from indisputable business value back to the work of a specific enabling team. We try to bridge this gap with business cases on the front end and detached metrics on the back end. But deep down, don't we know that both are often a form of performative nonsense? The core of the problem lies in what we're measuring. Take cycle time. In a predictable process, it's meaningful. For example, tracking a mortgage application from start to money in account. But in IT teams, we measure the story, and this unit tends, in practice, to be fundamentally broken. The items are not comparable, and the unit itself is amorphous. Generally, a story should mean work finished and in production, but it often doesn't. It can mean something short of this, requiring further work and more tickets or invisible uncounted work to get to that stage. There are teams out there religiously posting tool-based cycle time metrics who don't even have a shared, consistent definition of done. And even where a story is genuinely about something tangible being delivered to production, one story might be a 1-hour text change on the website. Another story could be a 3-week database migration. The resulting average cycle time is a statistically nonsensical figure. It's what Eric Ries, author of the lean startup would call a vanity metric. It is a sign that implies it signifies efficiency or value, but it's actually been severed from that meaning. This isn't Goodhart's law. It's much, much worse. People often quote Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. This is the problem of gaming the numbers, and it is endemic. I have a friend, a developer, whose team is measured on their number of code commits. This metric is irrelevant to their technology, but stats are stats. A portion of the day is now spent making pointless, trivial commits to keep the numbers up, forcing them to context switch away from valuable work. This is not just a random, local dysfunction. It is a behavior that is actively encouraged and systemized by big-name consultancies. McKinsey, for example, published a controversial and widely criticized by industry experts framework suggesting, yes, you can measure software developer productivity. They were shilling precisely this kind of thinking around boardrooms, promoting tools that elevate reductive metrics, like the number of code commits from my friend's anecdote, into a false science. This is Goodhart's law in action, sold to us from the top down. But my concern goes beyond Goodhart's law. We are obsessing over metrics that were never good measures in the first place. This dysfunction operates on two levels. The first, and most common, is the feature factory problem, which focuses on outputs, stories completed. This is the default behavior for what product management thought leader Marty Kagan calls feature teams. We get so busy shipping features that we have no time to ask if we are empowered teams solving actual customer problems, especially when the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, has long shown that the vast majority of product value typically comes from a tiny fraction of its features. On a deeper level, however, the organizational compulsion to simply have metrics and fill dashboards is so strong that we invent and measure data points that don't even have the dubious value of the feature factory. These are signals detached even from production, existing only to prove that a report has been filled, the numbers are looking good, and we should all keep our jobs or be promoted. The Monte Carlo fallacy. This pursuit of false certainty reaches its peak with Monte Carlo simulations, a powerful forecasting technique that runs thousands of simulations on historical data to predict probable outcomes. It works brilliantly in finance and manufacturing because it's fed clean, comparable data. A pound is always a pound. A widget is always a widget. Its entire validity rests on this assumption that historical data is statistically sound and representative of future events. But what happens when we apply this in corporate IT? A manager, desperate for a date, asks for one. The team feeds its meaningless historical data, manually entered, inconsistent, measuring incomparable stories, into the simulation. The model runs 10,000 iterations on statistical quicksand and produces a scientifically probabilistic forecast. There is an 85% chance we will finish by 15th of October. This is the pinnacle of performance of bureaucracy. It's a mathematical laundry operation for bad data, creating a comforting, precise, and utterly false sense of predictability. If the team delivers by the stated date, it's probably because they committed to it. They're focused on it, not because of the maths. The new sign on the same old shop. If we step back from these specific examples, the game commits, the meaningless cycle times, the Monte Carlo theatre, a pattern emerges. This brings us back to the core linguistic problem I introduced earlier. This dysfunction happens on two levels. One, the new name fallacy. We co-opt the solution. We apply a new signifier, like agile, but the signified remains the same old dysfunctional project management. It's just a new sign on the same old shop. Two, the metrics fallacy. We co-opt the problem. Our metrics, cycle time, story points, are signifiers that they signify business value. But as we've seen, they don't. The sign no longer points to reality. It only points to itself, creating a closed loop of self-serving bureaucracy. This is exactly what happens with frameworks like OKRs, objectives and key results, which all too often become another example of this. The OKR label, the signifier, wasn't intended to be a new name for old hackneyed statistical reporting. Just as agile wasn't supposed to be a new word for project management. But that is precisely what has happened. The sign, the objective, is supposed to point to an outcome, the signified value. But the bureaucracy, uncomfortable with this ambiguity, co-opts the term and forces the sign to point back to a familiar output, the new signified. Increased customer retention becomes ship Project X by Q3. The sign has been successfully and destructively reassigned. So, what now? If you've listened this far, you might be feeling a mix of recognition and despair. Perhaps you've seen these patterns in your own organizations. The dashboards that everyone pretends to believe, the metrics that disconnect from reality, quarter by quarter, sprint by sprint. The question isn't whether this diagnosis is correct, and you already know it is, but whether anything can be done about it. I want to be honest. There are no easy fixes here. No new framework to adopt that won't eventually be co-opted the same way. But there are practices and structural changes that can help. Not because they're immune to bureaucratic capture, but because they work with human nature rather than against it, and because they shift focus from producing numbers to producing value. A path forward. People, discipline, proximity, and structure. The alternative to this learned helplessness isn't to abandon all tracking or measurement. It's to understand their severe limits and refocus on what actually works, even when it doesn't produce a quarterly or per sprint dashboard. The foundational assumption we've forgotten. Before we've discussed specific practices, we need to confront the belief system that created the metrics obsession in the first place. At its root, this entire apparatus of surveillance, the dashboards, the velocity tracking, the commit counts, exists because we've stopped trusting people to do good work. We've created elaborate systems of measurement because we assume, at some level, that people need to be watched, measured, and controlled, or they'll slack off. But this is backwards. People intrinsically want to do meaningful work. It's why they chose challenging careers in the first place. The surveillance systems we build don't prevent laziness. They create disengagement. They signal distrust, which breeds exactly the behavior they were designed to prevent. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We don't trust people, so we measure them. The measurements signal our distrust, people disengage. And this proves we have needed the metrics all along. The alternative isn't naive, it's structurally different. It means building organizations on the assumption that people want to contribute, and then actually giving them the conditions to do so. Clear purposes, outcomes, not outputs, genuine autonomy, proximity to the impact of their work, and leaders who see their role as removing obstacles rather than monitoring performance. This requires what servant leadership actually means, not the corporatized version. It means empathy, trust, and the humility to admit what we don't know. These sound like soft skills. They're not. They're the hard structural work of building organizations where good work can happen naturally, rather than having to be extracted through measurement. To return to our linguistic framework, we've let management, the signifier, become disconnected from enabling good work, the signified, and reconnected it to surveillance and control. Reclaiming the term means reconnecting it to service. It means recognizing that the most important question isn't how do we measure performance, but how do we create the conditions where good performance is the natural outcome. For everyone, get the people right. The simplest answer to how do we increase performance is often to get the people right. This means doing everything you can to recruit the best, most motivated people, to build your teams, and just as importantly, where someone turns out not to be that person, who perhaps isn't pulling their weight and is dragging down team morale, agreeing to part ways quickly, cleanly, and respectfully. High-performing teams are satisfying to be part of, and this foundation is non-negotiable. I realize this can sound hand-wavy. At the C-suite level, most organizations already invest heavily in hiring the best people for their executive teams. But further down the hierarchy, something different happens. Modern corporate practices actively undermine this principle. People outside the C-suite are often treated as resources rather than talent. and the primary concern shifts from best fit to cheapest day rate. This is the logic that drives outsourcing and offshoring decisions, made primarily on cost, with only secondary, if any, regard to building high-performing teams, as if such things are only relevant at the top of the shop. Perhaps this is a symptom of having too many accountants and too few engineers at the top of the shop. When leadership views the workforce through a spreadsheet rather than understanding that software is a creative, collaborative discipline, they optimize for the wrong variables. The irony is that the metrics obsession we've critiqued throughout this article stems from the same root, a belief that complex human work can be reduced to fungible units and managed at a distance through numbers. For teams, the discipline of meaningful records. With this foundation in place, teams must create an inspectable record of their work. This is also a non-negotiable. Until recently, this was a massive overhead, and it was understandable how stretched teams were unenthusiastic about documenting stories, requirements, and plans, and doing so drained significant work from getting on with the work. However, with the proliferation of generative AI tools, this friction is vanishing. Creating a rich, accurate record has never been easier. Need a meaningful user story? Record a semi-structured conversation with a stakeholder, feed the transcript to an AI with a canned prompt, and voila! You have the bones of a really strong user story in seconds, not hours or days. We must also change the why. This record is not to feed the metrics machine for the management. It is a mark of professional discipline. It is the team's own audit trail, their own learning log, their own defense against chaos. It builds team accountability and a foundation for genuine, internally driven improvement. We may think we've already told our teams this. We may also think that we mean it. But my experience is that teams haven't heard it, and where they have, they don't believe it. As Colin Powell said, I'm often asked, how do you know when you've communicated enough? And I say, when you've communicated it so much that you're sick of hearing it yourself, and then you've communicated it about half as much as you need to. For measurement, resist the siren call of the better metric. This doesn't mean abandoning all measurement, but it does mean being brutally honest about what we can and what we cannot know. Thinkers like John Smart are right to warn us away from proxy metrics, the story points and velocity charts that create a comforting illusion of insight, while measuring nothing of substance. But here's the trap. The instinct is to find the next set of metrics, the right ones this time. DORA metrics, flow efficiency, lead time for changes. These frameworks promise to finally bridge the gap between our work and actual business value. And theoretically, they should. But in practice, they suffer the same fate as OKRs. The bureaucracy co-opts them. The signifier gets reassigned. Deployment frequency becomes a target to gain rather than a signal to learn from. We get a new dashboard with new numbers. The same performative comfort and the same disconnection from real value. The uncomfortable truth is this. If you cannot directly and honestly trace a metric back to genuine business outcomes, not theoretically, not through correlation studies, but in your specific context, then perhaps you shouldn't be measuring it at all. The discipline we need isn't finding better proxy metrics, it's having the courage to admit when we simply don't know, and focusing our energy on the structural and human changes that actually move the needle, even when they don't produce a neat dashboard for the sprint or quarterly review. For managers and scrum masters, the solution of gaining proximity. The role of management must then change from overseer to enabler and team member. This requires following the advice of systems thinking pioneers like W. Edwards Deming, getting closer to the actual work. Rather than just being the cox at the back of the rowboat, roll up your sleeves and do some of the rowing. Only by being connected to the work itself can we move from asking, what's the cycle time, to what's the most significant bottleneck you're facing, and how can I help remove it? For organizations, the structural fix. The metric culture is a symptom of 20th century corporate pyramids. This structure creates layer upon layer of management, putting smart, hard-working people in an impossible position. They are detached from the work, i.e. the coal face, and detached from power, i.e. the C-suite. Their primary function is to attend meetings and reports demand numbers. The metrics are a performative act of relevance. The only true fix is structural. Build flatter organizations. The goal isn't just to get managers involved, it's to have fewer layers of management. It's to take those same smart people and put them back into the teams, not stack them on top of them. It's to finally deliver on the promise of Agile, a network of small, empowered teams that are trusted with outcomes to achieve, not outputs to report on. Let's stop celebrating coherent nonsense and start the hard work of structural change. What's your experience? Do you see these metrics fallacies in your organizations? How do you keep the focus on real value over abstract numbers?